Hey guys, in this video we are going to be talking a little bit about George Orwell. We're going to be talking about his essay, Politics in the English Language, and then I'm going to make some applications to 1984. So I mentioned this in the assignment, but just again, you want paper out or a screen open so that you can take notes while I am talking, because I'm going to ask for either pictures of those notes or for you to just turn those notes in here when you are done with this video. And I want to see that you have actually kind of not just understood what I've said, but sort of branched out from what I've said. So just like we always talk about with notes, you are using this as an opportunity for your own thinking, not necessarily just writing down exactly what I said. So if I say something that sparks an idea, feel free to write that down. You can also, what's kind of nice, rather than when we are in class, is you can pause the video and, go off on a tangent if you want to, and then come back to the video. So let's talk about George Orwell first, just so that you can have a bit of background on him. I kind of suspect that most of you read Animal Farm in 10th grade, which is the other George Orwell novel that people know him very well for. Lots of people know him for 1984 and Animal Farm, because we read those so widely in high school classes. But the other thing that he is known for is his essays. He wrote hundreds of essays, and he's considered one of the best essayists of all time. People who study the form often go back to George Orwell to look at how it's done. So that Politics in the English Language essay, that might be his most famous. It has, not just in the form, but also in the ideas, inspired many people to think about the way that language works. The other thing that you might have heard about him, especially when you were doing Animal Farm, is that he's a democratic socialist, kind of famously a democratic socialist. Like Bernie Sanders. And so that means that he wasn't fully a communist, and he was very critical of communist ideas, but he was especially critical of the way that communist ideas had been put into practice. So as we were reading this book, it's not like George Orwell is on the libertarian side of things, where he's like, everyone must be completely free to buy as many guns as they want or whatever. Sorry, too political. But basically, he was still in favor of a lot of socialist ideas and socialist programs, but just felt like the governments that have kind of taken on those ideas have become totalitarian governments, right? One thing that kind of led him along this path is his background. He was born in India when India was under British rule. So he was born into this colonialist setting, and he was on the side of the colonialists, right? He's a British guy. His parents were kind of like lower down British royalty, I think like a duke and a duchess or something. And his father worked for the Indian Civil Service in India, which is basically like their police force. Their police force was run, and the employees were all British, not Indians. So he was kind of born into this kind of like empirical regime. And then when he was 1, though, his mom decided that she wanted him in the education system in England. So she brought the kids back to England, and he didn't see his dad again until he was 9 years old. And in England, he mostly spent his time at boarding school, including the most famous English boarding school, Eton. That is where all the royalty go, like Prince Henry and William and so on. And he didn't realize this for a long time, but he was there on scholarship, because just because his parents were royalty didn't mean that they were rich. And so that kind of gave him a sort of sense of what could be possible with things like a good public education, for example, or scholarships, or, helping people out at the bottom sort of achieve the same level of success as people at the top. He wasn't a great student, though. He didn't really care too much about formal education, and instead he was really interested in working on the school paper. So he was always obsessed with writing, what writing could do. But after school, because he wasn't such a great student. He decided not to go into academia. He went into the Burma Imperial Police, which is like the Indian Civil Service that his dad did, but it was in Burma. So here's an English guy in Burma trying to govern a country where he didn't really know anything about the culture. And while he was there, though, he thought it was super boring. He thought being a policeman was like very dull. He didn't feel like the life of ideas there that he wanted to spend his time thinking about. So instead he became this like kind of eccentric outsider. Like he was trying to kind of like incorporate a bunch of like Burmese culture into his own life. So I just think this is an interesting little factoid about him. He had knuckle tattoos because he saw people in Burma getting a lot of tattoos and he was like, that's cool. So George Orwell had like knuckle tattoos. Anyway, so he got sick there. He got dengue fever. He was honestly sick and injured his whole life. He had very bad luck that way. And he was sent home and he decided like, Burmese police, it's not for me. And that's where he decided to become a writer. And at first he was working as a reporter with a bunch of odd jobs too. Like he was a teacher, he was a book clerk, all this stuff. And then he decided, he saw a bunch of his writer friends going and doing this. He decided to go fight in the Spanish Civil War on the Republican side, so against the fascist dictatorship there. And while he was there fighting, he was shot in the throat. It, like by millimeters, missed the artery. He was shot in the throat, went all the way through by a sniper. And so at that point he was sent home. Like I said, he had very bad luck that way. But while he was home, he had time to recuperate finally, and this was kind of the time he needed to settle down and work on his writing, and that's when he wrote Animal Farm and then 1984, and they were big hits. They supported his writing career from then on. I'm hating this glare on my glasses. Well, I just look like a cyborg. He became very successful as a writer, and he wrote essays and more novels, and worked as a reporter and so on, until he died of tuberculosis very young, actually. He died at the age of 46. So one of the reasons that we don't have more novels from George Orwell is just because he died so early. Okay, so let's talk about this essay that I made you read before we talk about 1984. This essay is called Politics in the English Language. If you had my class last year, AP Language, then you read this already and we talked about it extensively. We're not going to talk about it as much in here because your reading skills are such that you are able to understand it. But we need to talk about a couple ideas. So basically on the surface, this essay looks like it is a style guide. Like it looks like he's telling you how to be precise and clear in your writing and how to write well. But underneath it is actually a very nuanced argument about the way that thought and language interact. So basically he has this line. Actually, I'm just going to read the second paragraph for you. It says, "Now it is clear that the decline of a language must ultimately have political and economic causes. It is not due simply to the bad influence of this or that individual writer. But an effect can become a cause, reinforcing the original cause and producing the same effect in an intensified form, and so on indefinitely. A man may take to drink because he feels himself to be a failure, and then fail all the more completely because he drinks. It is rather the same thing that is happening to the English language. It becomes ugly and inaccurate because our thoughts are foolish, but the slovenliness of our language makes it easier for us to have foolish thoughts." Okay, so basically he's talking about this vicious kind of cycle that happens psychologically with things, right? He first compares it to drinking. You drink, you feel like a failure, and so you drink. But then drinking makes you feel like more of a failure, and it just goes on, and it kind of snowballs, right? And he says that basically language is working the same way, where our thoughts are foolish. He says slovenly. This is where, if we were in a class discussion, I would say, what does slovenly mean? But basically it's like lazy, like almost like gluttonously lazy. So thoughts become, because thoughts are sloven, I don't think that's a word, foolish and lazy. We produce language then that echoes those foolish and lazy thoughts, but by producing that language that only reinforces the foolish and lazy thoughts. So if you think about it as a kind of cycle, right? You have thought at the top and then you have language at the bottom. Thought is influencing language, but then language comes back around and influences thought. And what you are left with is a bit of a chicken or an egg problem, right? Because what came first? Did the bad thoughts come first, or the lazy thoughts? Or did the lazy language come first? And the other problem that it presents us is how to get out of that cycle. If your thoughts are influenced by language and your language is influenced by thoughts, then where can your thoughts or your language, I guess, break through and produce something that is not lazy or foolish? Like, how do you reverse that cycle if you're stuck in it? And George Orwell has some ideas for how to do that. He says, you know, it's a bad habit. Let me continue going with this paragraph. The point is that the process is reversible. Modern English, especially written English, is full of bad habits, which spread by imitation and which can be avoided if one is willing to take the necessary trouble. If one gets rid of those habits, one can think more clearly. And to think clearly is a necessary first step toward political regeneration, so that the fight against bad English is not frivolous and is not the exclusive concern of professional writers. So basically what he's talking about there is that basically we've gotten into a habit of this bad thinking, and that we could, especially writers, could pull us out of that habit just by being more careful with the way that they are saying and writing things. He has this phrase that says, let the meaning, that's what I'm looking for, let the meaning choose the thought. I think it's at the end here. Yeah, so what is needed what is above all needed, this is on this like second to last page, is to let the meaning choose the word and not the other way around. Orwell does not fully give us an answer to the chicken or the egg problem, though. He never says, here's where language comes from. Here's what language is sort of capable of doing if we, you know, if we get out of that sort of habit, right? To me, he presents that problem and then he just says, but don't do it. And that's pretty difficult to do. And you can see that as a bit cynical, because if we are stuck in the political habits that we have, how do we get out of them? Or you could think of it as almost unrealistically optimistic, which is like, you've just presented the problem of being stuck in this cycle, and then you say, so get out of the cycle, but doesn't quite tell us how our thoughts are going to escape that in order to let meaning choose the right words, right? And one of the words that he is very interested in here is, well, two of the words are fascism and democracy. I think these days we can think about that in terms of the Democratic primaries, which is kind of interesting. Like, you think of how the word socialist is thrown around and how the word moderate is thrown around. And then I ask students, when we talk about this in Lang, I ask students to tell me, what does socialism mean? And what does a moderate candidate mean in relation to a socialist candidate? And they often can't fully articulate that. Now, I'm not saying that no one can. I think that people have definite ideas of what socialism and moderacy, are. But the fact that in our political landscape and how the media kind of regurgitates those terms, the fact that we can't fully articulate them is very telling. It means that those terms are becoming like propaganda. And the way that propaganda works, and finally we're getting to 1984, excuse me, is that it is about conveying a feeling and not an idea. Right, so you can use a word like democracy, and it has positive feelings, and you're like, yeah, democracy. But what we don't realize is that, you know, places like Iran also call themselves a democracy, right? Because that word can have positive feelings regardless of what the definition is, and it has become so much about a feeling that no one even knows what the definition is really anymore, or very few people know, and that there can be arguments around the meaning of the word now because of the way that it has become all about connotation instead of denotation, right? And so right now we see a candidate like Bernie Sanders that is trying to change the connotation of a term like socialist. And you also see how extremely difficult that is, right? You know, as people accuse him of being a socialist and he sort of just accepts it and says, yeah, I'm a democratic socialist, that comes with all the negative feelings that socialism has had since, you know, when this book was written. So yeah, I think that kind of articulates his idea in politics in the English language. So let's see how that is playing out in the novel. So the very first thing is to think about thought. If we're thinking about this cycle of thought and language, let's think about Winston's thought for a second here. And have your books out, pause it if you don't have your book out and pull out your book.